minute. Thank you. And we are recording today. We are spotlighting the speakers so that others will not show. And yes, so as I mentioned, this is one of the primary root causes we see of our housing crisis, and we need to understand that this doesn't just happen, and it's a result of deliberate actions, deliberate laws that have been implemented. And so we are looking forward to hear more from Julia and dive deeper into this. We will do a presentation first. You're welcome to put questions in the chat. We'll probably save them for afterwards. We're saving room at the end for Q&A, so there will be time for questions. And I think I will just turn it over to Julia now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Super excited to be here to talk about the law behind the hyper-commodification of housing. And before we jump into any substance, I want to just introduce myself so you have some idea who I am. I'm actually Canadian, so my background is I'm a lawyer from Canada, but I did my master's in law at Columbia Law School in New York. And during that master's, I did a research paper on this exact topic, but it was focused more on New York City, New York State, and federally about the hyper-commodification of housing and specifically the laws behind that. Beyond housing, I'm really interested in socioeconomic rights generally and seeing how law, which has so often been used to negatively contribute to a lot of the problems we're facing in the poly crisis, could be used positively as well. So I'm interested in both investigating how we got here and also how we can use law as a tool to support social movements. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And here's a bit of a plan for the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to discuss the housing crisis generally, the system we're in, and then a bit about law and how law, not just markets, have built this system. Looking a bit at law versus policy, those are sometimes words that are thrown around together and often really overlapping. So we'll talk about that. Dive into some financialization and commodification topics, specifically with a legal lens. And that's how we got here. And then a bit of a path forward. That part will be a bit shorter. And then a wrap up in Q&A. You're welcome, as mentioned, to throw questions in the chat. I probably won't get to them as I'm talking, but I'm going to throw my email up at the end as well. If your question doesn't get answered, I'm happy to follow up afterwards if that makes sense. So here are just a couple headlines I pulled from the last couple weeks or month or so. And you can really tell that a housing crisis is the term that dominates headlines. But I really wanted to see what if this isn't really a crisis at all? And if we peel back these headlines, what's behind them? What laws got us here? So it really matters how we conceptualize and talk about these problems. So this quote is from actually a Canadian economist, and his focus is on tenant rights. I won't read this whole quote that's on the screen, but you're welcome to. The point is basically that there isn't a housing crisis. There are people who are 100% in a crisis mode because of housing, but a crisis implies a deviation from a standard, an exceptional or temporary event. And the thing is that this is not that. So there's a fair number of researchers looking into this. One of those is named John Whitlow, and he says that unaffordability, as related to housing, is a predictable outcome of capitalist spatial development. And then Ricardo Tranjan, whose quote is on this screen, mentions that this is not a housing crisis. Instead, it's just a market operating as a market. And the part that really interests me is that laws allow it. So if laws are allowing it, what do these laws look like and how did we get here? So that's really my interest. Housing injustice is not a glitch. It's the market operating as the market, and it's able to do so because of the law. So Although I did my research on New York, uh, my focus really for the research was on a larger area of the US or North America as a whole. And I know I'm speaking to likely most of you based in Seattle or at least in Washington. And I think that this is familiar across the entire country. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that a worker with a full time minimum wage job can only afford a one bedroom apartment in 7% of the United States counties and can't afford a two-bedroom apartment anywhere in the country. This will likely not be surprising to anyone on this call. And I know in Seattle specifically that homelessness continues to rise and the price of housing is out of reach for many. Or typically there's a 30% value for affordability, although there's no clear definition or clarity across the entire country. But most people are likely reaching up or spending more than 30% of their income on housing, especially if they're moving today. Yet the interesting thing is at the same time, housing in Seattle, in Washington, and the rest of the US is a really valuable asset. In fact, housing has become by far the most valuable asset on earth. It's worth 3 times more than the global GDP and more than 20 times all the gold ever mined. So it is this really interesting dichotomy of it being worth so much and yet out of reach and really difficult as what it's meant to be, a place to call home. And the really other interesting piece here is that it wasn't really until after 1950, which is not that long ago, that housing moved into kind of this liquid asset and real estate industry. So we're in a relatively new kind of industry that's really taken off, and people can't afford to be living anywhere. So there's a real dichotomy here happening. And so, where does the law kind of fit in here? Law matters to housing. Law and land and housing are social resources that have been transformed into commodities, as we can see with the value of real estate being so high. And the way they've been commodified is not accidental, it's through law. This was not a natural transition, it was legally constructed. And interestingly, there's a growing, it's called the Law and Political Economy, LPE, if anyone's interested in looking it up after. And it's an intellectual movement, which is really looking at the various scales of government across jurisdictions, across countries, to evaluate questions of distribution, power, and democracy. And one of the pieces that fits really well into this movement is housing. To notice that the way we've constructed housing is really a result of markets, but the markets are operating that way because law has allowed them to, and the states have created those laws to allow that. And so it really shows how the current housing crisis is a result of commodification. And this commodification has been substantially constituted by law. And my interest today is to discuss some of these laws behind, but I also want to draw attention to what I won't be talking about today because it's equally important. I won't be focusing on segregation or laws like redlining and a lot of the impacts, especially in the US, that have created such differences across people. So racism has long ties, obviously, in America, and it's really been connected to housing, and law has been a key part of that. And so I'm not discussing it today, but I want to draw your attention that I'm aware of it and it's important. And if you're interested in reading more, there's some great books like The Color of Law and items on that. So, to take kind of a step back, so we're all on the same page, I want to discuss the difference between law and policy. These ideas are very interconnected, but they are distinct. And this distinction is important, especially from an advocacy perspective, and to understand how we got here, how we can get out. And so I'm going to go through a little bit about law first. And I'll try to make this as least dry as possible because this might not be exciting to everyone in the room, despite it being exciting to me. So there's kind of two core ideas of law. in North America. There's public law and private law. Public law is really anything that governs the relationship between the state or the government and the public. So that could be a constitutional law problem, that could be an administrative law or criminal law. Constitutional law is law that's based on the US and state constitutions. So most people are familiar with kind of your US constitutions, but obviously most states also have their own constitutions. These are kind of the biggest types of law, and everything else fits within them. Then administrative law are more connected to executive agencies and kind of less well known, but a really critical part of the structure. And criminal law, although it's not super relevant to today's discussion, is a type of public law, and it's offenses against society prosecuted by the state. There's also private law, which governs the relationship between private individuals and entities. So it could be a corporation and a corporation, or a person and a corporation. You might think of family law, contracts, torts, property. And so housing is really interesting because it can be both in the public law sphere and the private law sphere. But we won't talk too much about this, just so you understand the idea of types of law. And then laws are also made in a couple of ways. They're primarily either statutory or common law. So statutory laws are passed by legislative bodies and codified into statutes. Common law is made by judges. We live in the results basically from England, although the US has had a bit of a distinction, obviously, but common law is from England originally, and it builds on each other through precedent. Statutory laws are passed by the bodies. So think the US Congress passes national laws, your state passes laws at the state level. So Washington has specific laws. And then municipal governing authorities also can do ordinances, or what some people would think of as bylaws. And that's kind of the order also that laws are thought of as in. So you have your federal ones, your state ones, and then your municipal. And so municipal can't do something that the Constitution says is not possible. So it has to fit within all those orders. I also threw in executive orders here because in the current political climate, these are kind of showing up. So an executive order is a directive from the US president. And it is not a law that is passed by Congress, which is the typical way that a national law exists, but rather it's based on an existing law or constitutional authority, which is given to the president in the US Constitution. And they can't create new laws or mandates that exceed this authority. These are temporary, can be modified by future presidents, but they do exist, and we're seeing them exist now. So that's a bit about how the laws are made. But what's the difference between policy? Often we view them as the same thing. So law is really ultimately this authority. It's these rules, and it has legal force. They create powers, limits, and enforcement mechanisms. And as we just discussed, they can be made by statutory or common law. Now, policies are connected but are distinct, and they're really more about how law is implemented. So all policies that exist can be traced back to a law that gave the government, whichever level of government, the right to create that policy. So a government can't just create policies without having the authority to do so. Now, sometimes that authority looks really different than what the policy ends up being, but they need that authority to create. Policies also must comply with existing laws. And if they don't, then you sometimes see things going back to courts, and then the common law can step in, and or statutory law might be amended. And policies are a bit more transient to some extent. They can shift with the political climate, might not last as long as laws. Laws can be a bit harder to change. I thought it'd be timely and helpful to give a metaphor here, and a housing metaphor is what I thought of for this conversation. So law, if you're thinking about a house being built, law is comparable to the foundation and framing of a house, whereas policies are more what you do within the house. where or what you do with rooms, maybe what color you choose to paint the room, what furniture you put in it. And policies can, I hear that echo too. I think it's gone now. Okay. Policies can change quickly, but ultimately, um, the underlying structure determines what can be done. So the underlying structure determines where you can build, what you can change, what requires a permit, what will collapse if you mess with it. And interestingly, sometimes the policies you want to build don't fit into the current structure. So sometimes you just can't do that policy, but sometimes what happens is you need to renovate the legal framing. So maybe the actual foundation shifts a little bit and we make new laws. One more kind of example so we understand policy versus law. Together, policy and law establish the rights, the rules, the structures that govern our society. And so they're really in conversation always with social conditions and the needs of the public. So social conditions is on the far right of this side, and law responds to policy gaps and needs that the social conditions bring up. Now, policy also guides law. So that's why there's arrows going both ways between policy and law. Policy decisions can lead to new laws being created or laws being refined, but also policy needs legal authority. So policy can't exist without the law. And so it's a bit complicated because all of these systems are interconnected, but it's just a continuous feedback loop and they're all critical. So an example here, the United States Housing Act of 1937 is an act that was brought in 1937. And under Section 8 of this act, it authorizes that the federal government can provide housing assistance and defines the scope, powers, and limits of what that assistance can look like. And so this is an example of the law. It's a legal binding authority. It provides clear requirements as well as clear authority. And the Congress passed this law, the US Congress. Now, within this law, this is too small to read, so that's okay. You don't need to, but there's a section that outlines some policy goals related to this act and specifically related to Section 8 of this act. And these are statutory policy statements. So they're broad values that justify the law. But more importantly, they outline kind of what this policy and program can look like or should look like. But it doesn't provide all of the information. So Section 8 has led to the HUD Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8. And this is a policy or a program that implements this act. So that's kind of how all these things operate together. Now, this is administered by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. HUD can create regulations, they set program rules, they allocate funding, and then local entities administer the vouchers. So it's this whole framework that has come from this law. But if we just looked at HUD, we'd be missing the full story of where it came from with the law. So that's the difference. They're really connected, but they are distinct. And moving away from law for just a second, so we're all on the same page about commodification and financialization. Commodification is the name for the general process by which the economic value of something comes to dominate its other uses. And then hyper-commodification is simply the extreme case of that. And right now, we really see that housing is in a period of hyper-commodification in the US. So this means that every structure that leads to housing, so the legal material structures, have become commodities, every aspect of it. A lot of this initial research also has come from this book, In Defense of Housing, by David Madden and Peter Marcuse. I recommend it to anyone who's really interested in this topic and wants to dive a bit deeper. Financialization, hyper-financialization are similar to commodification. Again, it's about the idea that there's increasing involvement and power of people and firms who engage in creating profit through financial instruments. And this has happened to the housing market. Interestingly, with financialization, there's been some investigations by the UN and specifically Lelena Farha, who was the part of the UN housing for a couple years, and noted that the way capital investment in housing is increasingly disconnecting housing from its social function is undermining the realization of housing as a human right. So the comparison between housing as a commodity versus a human right, there's a real disconnect between that. And perhaps this won't be too much of a surprise to anyone, but the housing patchwork that exists today is a result of the economic and legal decisions that prioritize markets over government allocation and distribution of economic resources. So this process really started in the 70s and 80s. Ronald Reagan in the US with neoliberal policies giving control to the market. And there's been an increased reliance on corporate finance using housing as a way to make finance and equity. And so there's been private equity, hedge funds, REITs, pension funds, and we'll talk about REITs a little bit later. But interestingly, I think are really pension funds. So some of the largest retirement savings across North America, so in Canada and the US, have helped fuel the ongoing crisis. So often people don't even know that their pension is providing finance to landlords who then use that capital to acquire distressed real estate and build out their rental portfolios, which in turn is causing the housing crisis, which people who are in a pension might be impacted by. So this is kind of the framework for law, for commodity and financialization that interested me in exploring further the specific laws behind all of this. I also had the chance to work with Professor Katerina Pistor, who's written a book called The Code of Capital, another one I would recommend. It is a bit more legal heavy, but I think it's quite interesting if you can get past some of it. And her thesis is that capital or wealth and the inequality that comes from it is not alone. So it's created by a legal code. So she says there needs to be an asset and the legal code for wealth to come. And that asset in this case of our conversation is housing. And ultimately, law is essential for the inequality we're seeing today. And her book is not all kind of depressing about the role of law. It also mentions that law's inherent incompleteness makes it a fertile ground for legal creativity and imagination in every possible direction. So right now, the law has really bent towards capital and a tool to be used to build capital for certain people. But it doesn't mean that law couldn't be used for new purposes. For example, human rights, social rights, such as the right to housing. And so I wanted to see what was the law behind this housing. And so there are a lot of answers to that question. As we said, we only have an hour today, so I won't inundate you with laws, but there's a patchwork of laws specifically that have led to different policies and economic decisions that prioritize markets over government allocation and distribution of economic resources. So there's both been laws that support the financialization and commodification of housing, as well as laws that reduce any protections for tenants for non-market housing. And there's a few. So we're going to talk about REITs, real estate investment trusts, which were introduced in 1960 with a specific legislation, the Act to amend Section 5701 of the Internal Revenue Code, as well as we'll discuss housing voucher programs, which we've already seen, noting how housing voucher and tax incentive programs for private landlords, for financial landlords, does not pull us out of this commodification, but instead supports that. And then there was a series of post-2008 laws that have kind of shaken up the system. And so we'll discuss those as well. And then the Faircloth Amendment is an example of removing any protections. So starting off first with REITs, or real estate investment trusts. Currently, REITs own more than 4 trillion, in gross assets across the US. And currently, it's estimated that they own 1.8 million in real estate alone. And REITs were created by a congressional law in 1960. It's kind of small, but you can see it on a screenshot of it on the screen here. And the ultimate goal of passing this law was to encourage individual investors to invest in large scale income producing real estate, helps grow cities. It was meant to be a way to grow kind of economic well being and housing that's available. And REITs investors like because there are a variety of special tax rules. So they don't have to pay taxes on certain elements, they get dividends back, they don't have to be a traditional landlord. And there's also specific benefits for foreign investors who can invest directly without incurring the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, if there's a certain percentage of domestically controlled investors in the investment. So this is really a tool that's been used by a lot of uh, financial bodies to encourage financialization. And now what's happening is a lot of people's apartments are not even owned by landlords that probably even know where they live. Instead, they're owned by these large financial corporations, and the investors in large financial corporations likely don't know what they're fully investing in, except that they're getting a large dividend return and some tax benefits. And this is a huge system, and one of the reasons that housing behaves the way it does today. Because of these pass-through entity tax benefits for investors. And although we can blame these investors and maybe the corporations, ultimately this is a result of a law and an intention to allow investors to do this. Another example, which might be a bit controversial to discuss, is the idea that the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8, actually contributes to the housing crisis we're seeing in some ways. So HUD, which we previously discussed, has this Section 8 program. The way it operates is individuals who are lucky enough to be on the list, which is not everyone, pay a percentage of their rent, and HUD tops up the rest. It does not take the housing outside of the private market. So landlords can continue to raise the cost however high they want. Individual tenants don't necessarily have any say in that. And it remains a private market commodity that's simply helped by government funding. Similar other tax incentives exist. I know in Seattle, there's a Seattle multifamily tax exemption. And although a lot of these programs end up helping individuals a fair amount, making housing more affordable for some, it doesn't change the system. And systemically, it remains a market-based commodified system where the government comes in and tops up a little bit. But ultimately, what they're topping up and who they're supporting is the landlord. And they're supporting that private market price rather than trying to shift that price. So there's a kind of some complexity here and a question of, what loopholes can be put in by developers. There's, chances of saying how many affordable units you can build, but they don't last forever. And they'll ultimately find ways to benefit their bottom line when you keep it in the private market. Now, this is in reference to the 2008 crisis, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with if you're interested in housing. But the 2008 crisis actually had the opposite impact that people likely hoped for or expected. And individuals were actually blamed for taking on too much debt rather than the corporations who provided the debt. And there was a few actual laws that were put into force by the administration at the time. And ultimately, these laws valued economic recovery more than social welfare. And they bailed out these financial institutions to restore capital market stability rather than individual mortgage holders. And one of these laws was the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. And under that act, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, was created. And that was kind of the most important part of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. And through this, the federal government purchased troubled assets from the financial institutions. And then it ultimately encouraged banks to lower lending standards and drive consumers into the market at any cost. There was also the Recovery Act of 2008, or HERA, or HERA, and it was created to address the mortgage crisis of 2008 as well. But it ultimately is considered to have inadvertently contributed to increased investment in real estate. So there was a wider access to mortgage loans, and that resulted in higher housing prices. So these laws were really about the financial component, and they continue to have an impact today. And we can see the role of law in the financialization here. And the final thing I want to talk about is the erosion of protective measures. So the other laws were really supporting the financialization of housing, but there's also been a history of removing protective measures. Of course, neoliberal ideas of removal of state interference to some extent, the market can handle it. And so one way to do that was to remove public housing. And so the Faircloth Amendment of 1998 prevents net increases in public housing stock from the 1999 levels. And I apologize if this is too small, but the image on the left shows the decline in public housing across the US between 1996 and 2021. So around that time of the Faircloth Amendment. Now, it's important to note that today, we are nowhere near that housing stock number from 1999. So more housing stock of public housing could be built. But the idea of putting a cap on that has really decreased, obviously, the desire to build public housing, and has made certain, governments concerned about building public housing because of this cap. Moreover, there's been programs and policies throughout the years that have also decreased public housing. So in 1992, HUD launched the HOPE program, which demolished public housing in favor of building mixed income developments. But ultimately, that just resulted in public housing being demolished. There has been some goals to repeal the Faircloth Amendment, one most recently in 2000, but it didn't 2020, not 2000, but it did not make it to the Senate. So there's interest, and I do think learning more about this is important because it's a really unfortunate law on the books. And I see someone just asked about where that chart's from. I can provide the report to house our neighbors after this call. So ultimately, if we focus only on the market without an understanding of the law, we're missing some pieces. So the advancement of these neoliberalism policies and laws is really what has given the market the ability to do these extractive financial practices that have led to the commodification of housing and has made the financialization of housing even possible. So if we only talk about the market without the involvement of the state, we're missing something. And if we only talk about the state without the market, we're missing something. And so I also think we can't fully blame the real estate companies and investors for the housing injustices. They are using the legal powers of the state. They can say this was legal because it was. And profit seeking without consideration for social consequences is how a lot of these corporations work. And that's the role of regulation and laws to prohibit certain things. And so we need to change our logic here. And so I threw up a report, a headline that I found from the news only 2 days ago that says, "Build, Baby, Build, a plan to lower housing costs for all." And the idea of building more housing stock without recognizing that the private market is not the way to build more housing stock is an issue. And so we have to bring in this conversation in our advocacy. Moreover, policy or law by itself alone are not enough. They need to work together. we can have great policy ideas, we can have great programs at local levels, and we should, but they ultimately will not succeed on the levels we want when underlying law still incentivizes speculation, vacancy, corporate consolidation, and securitization. So law creates a structure, policy interprets, fills gaps, and delivers services. And so we really need to look at both as we're doing this. And so, what can law do? I think a lot of things, and these are just some of my ideas, and I welcome other ones. And some of them are being done, we're advocating for now. So, firstly, strengthening tenant protections and other protective measures. So, things like rent stabilization, anti eviction laws, but also support for tenant organizing, a legislative definition of affordable housing, and maybe a questioning of whether 30% of income is affordable or not. That number was kind of placed in, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion about it, and repealing outdated laws. Also, using law and policy to definancialize housing, limiting lending to corporate landlords, restricting pension fund investment and displacement, and just kind of creating bright line rules to refrain from offering more capital legal privileges like taxes, special regulation. Restructuring tax incentives flows naturally to that. A lot of these tax incentives are for the companies rather than for individuals. Expanding non-market housing, which I know House Our Neighbors is interested in. So social housing, public housing, that needs to be expanded. New creative approaches to that, repealing outdated restrictions like the Fair Cloth Amendment. And then I think requiring transparency and accountability. So this could be also in terms of politicians and what they're invested in. And then even for folks who invest with pensions or with some of those banks that maybe you don't know where all your investments are going, ensuring that there's some regulations, that it's clear what you're actually investing in. And this is from the Urban Institute. There's a lot of research and discussion about how we can approach housing changes. And they have an interesting report that covers kind of the spectrum of policies that can support housing decommodification and discussing housing decommodification. And all of these policies and laws are a good idea, but which ones are focused more on taking stuff out of the market? So just throwing this up there to show that there's a lot of people working on these and how we can kind of expand and change our conversation about housing. And I, despite maybe seeming somewhat optimistic, also recognize that we have to be aware of the current political climate. And so perhaps focusing on federal level is harder right now, but also part of my discussion is that the reason to invest in law, to reform all old laws, to get old laws off the books and new ones on, is that law is harder to change than policy. And so if there's a good time to bring in law, if there's time to prepare in advance and think about laws we would want, this is the time to do it. Law is harder to change than policy, and focusing on it can be important. Also, though, we're at a really unique time where with tariffs, there's increased construction costs. So the price of building more housing is going to be high, with a administration that obviously enjoys the private market. And then also just last week, I think it was, there was an administrative policy change to a homeless permanent housing program, a shift away from long-term permanent housing towards temporary. And this is really aligned with kind of what was mentioned in Project 2025 for homelessness. So it's a time to be creative, but it's a difficult time as well. And really briefly, just want to draw your attention to some more legal scholarship that I think is interesting. This is a paper by Kate Andreas and Benjamin Sachs. And they talk about the idea of building countervailing power through tenant unions. And the idea of countervailing power is to balance that of the wealth. So a large group of people who are non-wealthy don't have that much power, but together they will have more power. So they're researchers from the labor law field and bringing the ideas of labor law into housing, and how law can support that countervailing power. So not a huge discussion into that, but knowing that these type of systems, this is a time and an interest of similar to probably labor law conditions decades ago. So just to wrap up a little bit, the housing crisis is not an accident. It's not a natural impact. It's a market operating as a market, and it's the outcome of deliberate legal choices that allowed the market to operate this way. Because law helped produce this, law can also potentially help undo it or reframe and reposition. There's potential that the housing system can be acted upon, modified, or changed. And true solutions to the housing problem and crises require an alternative logic. So, yeah. And this is a quote from Frederick Engels from 1872. And my point with this quote is just that we can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. So if we want to create a non-market housing system and stop incentivizing market housing, we have to change what we're used to. And that might be harder than some of us are expecting. But ultimately, housing's value as a home and as a right must be reconceptualized and legally protected and not left to the market. So I hope that wasn't too legally dense, but I open up any questions at this point, and I'll do my best to answer them. And if not, you can follow up with me with my email here. I'll also throw it in the chat because I think I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see each other's faces. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Julia. We will turn off the recording now to be as possible on your end.